Welcome back. This session, let's discuss body politics, beauty standards, body autonomy, reproductive rights. Body politics refers to the ways in which power, culture, and institutions act on bodies, making them sites where gendered, sexual, racial, caste, class, and national hierarchies are inscribed. Not only inscribed but regulated and even contested. Feminist scholars argue that bodies are not simply biological entities, but they are socially constructed through norms, laws, and everyday practices that determine when bodies are seen as normal, beautiful, respectable, or even worthy of protection, and which are marked as deviant, excessive, or even disposable. In this sense, body politics links beauty standards, bodily autonomy, and reproductive rights as interconnected terrains where control over gendered bodies is exercised and where struggles for justice and freedom are waged. Beauty standards as a technology of power are not neutral preferences but historically produced norms that define ideal femininity in terms of thinness, youth, fair or light skin, able-bodiedness, heterosexual desirability, and even class privilege. Feminist theorists influenced by mainly Michael Foucault emphasize that beauty norms function as disciplinary regimes that encourage women and gender diverse people to constantly monitor, correct, and invest in their bodies. Through practices such as dieting, skin lightening, cosmetic surgery, hair removal, and fashion consumption, bodies are made to conform to norms that simultaneously generate profit for global beauty industries and also reproduce patriarchal, racist, casteist, and even capitalist power. Susan Bordeaux describes the body as a medium of culture, arguing that pressures towards thinness, tone physics, and youthful appearances are expressions of broader anxieties about femininity, sexuality, and even control. Eating disorders, compulsive exercise, and even chronic dissatisfaction with one's appearance are not simply individual pathologies but symptomatic of a culture that teaches women that their social value lies primarily in how they look. Crucially, dissatisfaction is framed as a personal falling rather than an effect of structural power, which obscures the political nature of beauty standards and shifts responsibility onto individual women who feel they must work on themselves to be acceptable. Intersectionality in beauty politics. Now, beauty standards are experienced differently depending on race, class, caste, nationality, disability, and sexuality, making intersectionality central to analyzing beauty politics. For instance, post-colonial and African feminists highlight how colonial histories imposed Eurocentric ideals of straight hair, narrow noses, and light skin, devaluing darker, black, Dalit, and indigenous bodies, and fueling booming industries in skin lightening and hair straightening products. In South Asia, fairness creams and matrimonial advertisements reproduce caste and color hierarchies by equating fair and slim women with beauty, respectability, and marriageability, while darker and fat bodies are narrated as undesirable or undisciplined. Disability and queer studies scholars further show how dominant norms of beauty and attractiveness presume able-bodiedness, neurotypicality, and heterosexuality rendering disabled and queer bodies as either pitiable or hypersexualized. Trans and non binary people often face intense bodily scrutiny around their gender legibility, being pressured to conform to narrow cis-normative standards of masculinity or femininity in order to access recognition, safety, or even medical care. Thus, the politics of beauty is simultaneously about visibility and erasure, confirming symbolic capital and some bodies while exposing others to stigma, surveillance, and violence. Now, let's look at digital media, self surveillance, and self branding. Digital and social media intensify body politics by turning everyday life into an arena of constant visibility, comparison, and even evaluation. Platforms such as Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and even dating apps reward highly curated, filtered images that align with dominant beauty norms, reinforcing thinness, masculinity, light skin, and consumerist lifestyles as aspirational standards. Influencer culture and fitspiration content always blurs the line between health and appearance, while algorithmic amplification ensures that certain kinds of bodies and aesthetics are seen more desirable and profitable. At the same time, online spaces also host counter discourses of body positivity, fat activism, and queer and disability pride that challenge normative ideals and assert the beauty and dignity of marginalized bodies. Feminist and queer activists also use hashtags, campaigns, and visual storytelling to contest colorism, size discrimination, and transmisogyny, reframing beauty not as conformity to a narrow ideal but as affirmation of diverse embodiments. Yet, these resistant practices are often co opted by corporations that commodify body positivity while continuing to profit from insecurity, revealing the tensions between radical critique and market incorporation in contemporary body politics. Conceptualizing bodily autonomy. Now, bodily autonomy refers to a person's right to make free and informed decisions about their own body, including sexual, reproductive, medical, and appearance related choices without coercion, violence, or even discrimination. Feminist movements argue that autonomy is not only an individual right but also a collective and structured concern, since people's ability to exercise control over their own bodies depends on access to resources, information, supportive social norms, and even legal protections. Reproductive justice activists define body autonomy as the human right to maintain personal control, to have children, not to have children, and to parent children in safe and sustainable communities. The concept of bodily autonomy challenges multiple forms of state and social control, including gender-based violence, marital rape, forced sterilization, denial of contraception, non-consensual medical interventions, and conversion therapies targeting LGBTQ plus people. It also opposes the criminalization of queer, trans, and sex working bodies and the imposition of dress codes or morality policing that dictate how people, especially women and gender diverse persons, should behave in public spaces. Thus, body autonomy links everyday decisions about clothing, mobility, and sexual relationships to broader struggles over citizenship rights and the limits of state power. Now, let's look into reproductive rights to reproductive justice. Reproductive rights historically focused on legal access to contraception and abortion, framing reproductive freedom primarily as an individual civil and political right. What is crucial here is this rights based model has often been critiqued for centering privileged women, ignoring structural inequalities such as poverty, racism, disability, and migration status that shape who can actually exercise these rights. In response, women of color in the United States developed the reproductive justice framework in the 1990s, which links reproductive autonomy to social, economic, and environmental justice. Reproductive justice is the right not to have children and the right to parent children in safe, sustainable conditions, including access to housing, healthcare, education, and freedom from violence and environmental harm. This framework foregrounds how marginalized communities have historically experienced both forced reproduction and forced sterilization, as seen in coercive population control programs targeting Dalit, Adivasi, Black, Indigenous, and disabled people. It also highlights how criminalization of abortion, policing of pregnancy, and denial of prenatal and maternal care disproportionately harm poor, rural, and minority women and pregnant women, revealing the deeply unequal distribution of reproductive risk and burden. Legal developments and reproductive autonomy in India, in the Indian context, constitutional jurisprudence, and increasingly recognize reproductive decision making as a core component of personal liberty, privacy, dignity, and bodily integrity under Article 21. The Supreme Courts in Sucheta Srivatsava versus Chandigarh administration held that a woman's right to make reproductive choices, including procreation and abstaining from procreation, is a dimension of personal liberty and that a woman owns her body and this has the right over it. Subsequent decisions have affirmed that forced sterilization and denial of access to abortion services violate fundamental rights, situating reproductive autonomy within broader human rights commitments. A landmark 2022 judgment on abortion clarified that every pregnant person in India, including unmarried women and gender variant persons, has a right to reproductive decisional autonomy and access to safe, affordable, and reproductive health care. The court explicitly recognized structural barriers such as lack of health infrastructure, caste discrimination, poverty, and bureaucratic obstacle and directed the state to ensure accessible abortion, contraception, and comprehensive sexuality education across the country. At the same time, recent decisions restricting abortion in particular cases, such as 2023 refusal to allow termination for a woman with postpartum psychosis, demonstrate an ongoing push and pull in judicial approaches and highlight the fragility and contestation surrounding reproductive rights. Bodily politics in everyday reproductive experiences. Now let's look into this. Despite progressive judicial language, many men and pregnant women continue to experience limited reproductive autonomy in their everyday lives because of patriarchal family structures, community norms, and healthcare practices. Decisions about marriage, contraception, spacing of children, and even abortion are often mediated by husbands, in-laws, religious leaders, or healthcare providers rather than being treated as a sole choice of the person whose body is directly affected by this. Medical paternalism, stigma around premarital sexuality, caste-based discrimination and inadequate public health infrastructure all constrain the ability of marginalized people to seek timely and safe reproductive health care. Body politics is evident in how pregnant bodies are simultaneously celebrated as symbols of motherhood and nation while being denied agency in clinical and legal settings. Moral panics around sex selective abortion, adolescent sexuality, and surrogacy have led to regulatory regimes that often police and surveil women's reproductive choices rather than addressing structural inequalities and gender preferences for sons. Reproductive justice advocates argue that policies must shift from controlling women's fertility to supporting voluntary, informed, and dignified decision making, particularly for Dalits, Adivasis, Muslims, migrants, and queer communities who face multiple forms of marginalization. Trans and queer embodiments and reproductive rights. Now, when we look at this, trans, non-binary and queer people experience body politics through both gender recognition struggles and reproductive injustice that are often overlooked within mainstream debates. Access to gender affirming healthcare such as hormones and surgeries is frequently restricted by legal, medical, and financial barriers, and procedures are sometimes conditioned on sterilization or invasive psychiatric scrutiny that undermines bodily autonomy. Additionally, laws and policies that presume only cisgender heterosexual couples as legitimate parents can obstruct queer and trans people's access to adoption, assisted reproductive technologies, and parental recognition. Recent right-based statements by feminist and human rights organizations emphasize that struggle for bodily autonomy are interlinked and the rights of trans and cis women as well as intersex and non-binary people are not in conflict but mutually reinforcing. These interventions resist attempts to weaponize women's language to exclude or marginalize gender diverse people and insist that bodily autonomy must include freedom from gender based violence, medical coercion, and discriminatory laws for all. This intersectional lens expands the scope of bodily politics beyond cisgender women's experiences, underscoring that norms governing gender, sexuality, and reproduction are part of the same regulatory regime. Resistance practices and reclaiming the body across regions, feminist and queer movements have developed multiple strategies to resist oppressive body politics and reclaim bodily autonomy. These include campaigns against colorism and size discriminations, protests challenging dress codes and moral policing, legal advocacy for safe abortion access, and community-based health initiative and provide non-judgmental reproductive and sexual health services. Educational interventions in schools and universities, including gender and sexuality studies, curricula, enable crucial reflection on how beauty norms, sexuality, and reproduction are shaped by power and encourage students to view their bodies as sites of agency rather than shame. Art, literature, performance, and digital storytelling also play key roles in politicizing embodiment by offering counter images of fat, queer, disabled, and gender non-conforming bodies that refuse erasure and objectification. These cultural practices disrupt the gaze that positions women as objects of evaluation and instead foreground embodied experiences, pleasures, and resilience, challenging the assumption that respectability and beauty require conformity to dominant norms. By naming and contesting the mechanisms of control that operate through bodies, such resistance practices transform body politics from a story of regulation to one of collective struggle and imagination. So now coming to this session's case study, reproductive rights and bodily autonomy in Suchita Srivatsava's line of cases in India. A widely discussed example of body politics in Indian context is the jurisprudence surrounding reproductive autonomy that emerges from cases like Suchita Srivatsava versus Chandigarh administration and later abortion related decisions. In the Suchita Srivatsava case, the Supreme Court considered whether a woman with intellectual disability residing in a state-run institution could be compelled to undergo termination of pregnancy without her clear consent. The state authorities justified their request by invoking paternalistic protection and institutional convenience, effectively treating her body as an object to be managed rather than a subject with rights and own desires. The court, however, recognized that a woman's right to make reproductive choices is a dimension of personal liberty under Article 21 and explicitly articulated bodily autonomy, privacy, dignity, and bodily integrity as constitutional values. It held that decisions about whether to continue or terminate a pregnancy must primarily lie with the woman herself and that any restrictions must satisfy strict constitutional scrutiny, thereby rejecting blanket states' authority over women's reproductive capacities. The judgment thus refrained reproductive decision making from a question of institutional control and eugenic anxiety of individual rights and bodily self ownership, marking a significant shift in body politics at the constitutional level. Subsequent decisions, including the 2022 abortion ruling that extended access and recognized unmarried and gender variant persons as entitled to abortion care, built on this right based understanding of reproductive autonomy. The court identified structural barriers such as inadequate health facilities, stigma, and discrimination, and issued directives aiming to ensure that reproductive rights are meaningful in practice, not merely in paper, and at the same time, more recent restrictive decisions such as 2023 refusal of abortion for a woman with postpartum psychosis reveal how medicalized and moralizing narratives about women's reproductive responsibilities can still override expressed preferences and reinforce paternalistic control. Analyzed through the lens of body politics, the jurisprudential trajectory illustrates both the promise and the limits of legal recognition for bodily autonomy. On the other hand, the language of bodily integrity and reproductive choice disrupts the long-standing assumption that women's bodies are primarily reproductive assets for the family or the nation. On the other hand, persistent tensions between protection and autonomy and in between fetal personhood claims and pregnant people's rights show how law remains a contested arena where different visions of the gendered body are negotiated. For feminist and reproductive justice movements, these cases underscore the need to combine legal advocacy with broader struggles against stigma, caste and class inequalities, and medical and institutional powers so that constitutional promises of bodily autonomy become lived realities for all.